Okay, so beware, new setup. So, sorry if this is awkward or anything, but today I wanted to pretty much just go over what is Cecil Libraries and such, and also just like cover where the fuck I've been the past I want to say 200 days without a video now, something like that. But to explain, Cecil Libraries, the little library with the raven icon, kind of fella. That is poorly drawn, but that library. It is essentially just like a bundle of DLLs in which are aimed to essentially just bundle more functionality into system, which is the underlying libraries associated with C sharp. And it also is core to other APIs like Bapinex, Unity, which still uses really old net from what I recall. And then there's some other tooling like Image Sharp from Six Labors, and CSV Helper. These libraries mainly just intend to expand on these libraries and make them essentially more usable in the form of something called an object. These essentially are a constructor in which you pass properties in, and then within that constructor, there's functions in order to make certain things related to what you passed in actually work in a nice way. For example, if you passed in, let's just use color 255 as an example. And yeah, I know that's poorly written. With it, you would pass in something we call a type. This associates with how the text is processed. For example, bold would make it highlight bolded. Italic would italicize. And then there's some other ones like what I believe is called underlight in the object. This makes it so that when the text is highlighted and only when the text is highlighted, it will actually show the text. And then you also pass in a shade. This shade with color 255 can be anything between 0 to 255. And actually, I'm realizing the color is that object is actually called 256 because of the 256 shades. And then there's also some configurability. For example, you can toggle whether it is a background, or you can also determine if it counts as a reset. Now, let me just expand the canvas real quick. Just so that there's a little more room for me to write. Oh, not in the paint bucket. That's why. Okay. And then also in the same object, we have the following functions: get reset, which will take the color 255 this is being called on, and then also it will output a color 256 of the exact same setup, except reset true, which you can think of this as essentially just, hey, let's get a reset of this color object. And what we want is to get the object except reset is true. We don't want to alter the base object. We just want to make the reset be its own thing and reset, which associates with what we already provide in the constructor, which is the logic for resets already, because this came after. And then also the logic for handling backgrounds and their resets. And then in present, there is also two more functions: get type string, which essentially will take the color and then it takes the int type and then we switch it to a string based on the original type string that is passed into it. And then lastly, we have format. This takes the color 256. This also takes the config, and then with this info, we choose whether we format, whether we reset, foreground or whether we reset background. And with that, you may be wondering where the hell is the type reset? Well, that is back in the constructor that you made. If reset is toggled true, it sets the type to the same int that would normally be associated. I believe this one was a 3 around. So instead of a 3, it would put a 2 in front of that. For example, 23. The 2 in this case tells it, okay, let us undo essentially. That's not precisely what it does, but it essentially just undoes what happened previously. For example, if you turned italic on with 3, you'd turn it off with 23. And then if you turned it off with 23, you can turn it back on with 3, which more or less allows us to do what we're doing here. This formats a string related to the color, and then this gets the inverse of that to turn it off. Not a precise inverse right now, but an inverse of the relevant type. As mentioned somewhere in the document, I believe there was a plan for a get full reset. This would take the same properties, do the same thing, except we also account for this and this. For example, if our current mode was set to bold and reset was true, we would undo the bold, and then if, for example, the color was red, we'd undo that by setting it back to the console color by using reset foreground if it was foreground or background if it was background. It would work essentially the same way, just it resets everything related rather than just the type, which we'd assume most developers want. Which in the moment you need 2 of these in order to do that. And then another functionality that I wanted to add into here was essentially just get type. It would work really similar to get reset, except you pass in a type and the color. And then with that, you get a new color of that type. For example, if you originally had, let's say, red regular, and then you called get type of bold, it would pass back a color that is set to bold. And then in theory, we could also probably add something like a get foreground or get background. That way you can set, let's say, the config background to false on a color that was set to a background originally. This would make it so that you edit the foreground rather than the background for the change that you're after. But that is not all that the library offers because we also have some obsolete code stemming from an old mod of mine called and C mod. This was a mod in which it took Weapon X and told it, let's enable and see. It's not done in the best way, e.g., it requires Windows because of how the terminal works, and because Unity is a little bit of a prick sometimes. However, this came with some lists, a reset all, and get color from type. These lists provided 7 shade. Well, that's more so a 0 to 7 because there's 8 shades. But these each provided 8 shades associated with a type, which compared to this is obsolete. But essentially, what it did was make a list of 8 values for bold, italic, underlight, which I believe was called invisible, and essentially allowed you to say, hey, let's do color list at 8. This would then turn white, and then if it was bold, the color list, then it would also bold. And then with the reset, you just call codeless.reset. This would reset both the foreground, any text processing, and the background. And then lastly, we have the get color from type. This took the lists and just put everything into a function. This function would essentially be a switch of the type, and it would also take a color, which could be an int or a string. E.g., get color from int, get color from string. But with that color came a second switch. The switch essentially deciphered whether the color was a value between 0 to 7. This one determined the list grab, which, mind you, this had a list for almost every single type available, which means, for example, for high intensity bold, you'd have to pass in roughly high intensity bulb. And yeah, I know the text is giving hieroglyphics. I know. But essentially, this function would take that high intensity bulb and the shade that you passed in, and then it would do list at it, which would roughly say, oh, hey, we have this type. Let's switch that to the list that we're after, and then take the shade that was passed in, and then get that list at the shade passed in, which is a lot more convoluted than just, let's say, doing this, which is why this is completely obsolete and why it is highly, so word for it, because ear recommended, not recommended, unrecommended doesn't really check out. But I guess just not recommended to be used in general. And then that's roughly what Cecil and Cecil's does. I didn't mean to cover all of that, but oh well. Was meaning to cover that anyway. Back to Cecil Libraries in general. It is essentially just a library of utilities, essentially, which just extend upon existing APIs and make them easier to work with. And then I think I'm gonna make this video just a little bit longer. Got one more thing to try and explain. So bear with me because this is a long one and I need to pull that up real quick. It should only take a few minutes as I speak. Just depends on how long it takes me to actually get to the page. Okay, I've got it. So with this section, I want to explain a thing which we have called the C cell libraries license. 1.0.0. Because there's probably going to be a few iterations over the course of the library. But let's start off with explaining how it is organized. So first off, there is two copyright holders, being the organization The organization holds the ultimate rights to the library, and then there is also the founders. This is the group that originally made the library and published it and put the license on the project. For example, on the Cecil Libraries license, this is Cecil Libraries org or organization. And then this one would be a Chaosier, which to clear up some error, this is both me, Zaxby Mod, which is the old GitHub name, and also the Stone Lord, which we figure is pretty obvious by the code comments, but just in case it's not, I figured I'd state that there. This is all technically me, though I'd really call it a us because we are a vessel under Chaos here. Anyways, this license is dominant, e.g., it affects the sublicense and overrules anything in which may conflict between it and the sublicense. And also any license that is on the same license file as this that is unspecified as being a primary license will be automatically considered a sublicense. And then let me just get the key terms out of the way. The founder is essentially the person who originally created the library. Or if that's not applicable, the group that originally created the library. And then the organization, which I'm going to abbreviate as org, is essentially the GitHub team in which contains products which are provided by the group behind the license. Mainly the organization that would hold copyright on the license. And this is just a simplification, just so it's obvious that any Cecil Libraries licenses on a Cecil product refers back to Cecil. Contributors are essentially anyone who would contribute to the project, e.g., adding functionality, code, etc. They're considered the contributor. And we will cover this later. They can hold a license on the product for their own code. The developer uses the product for their project. There is also some subclasses of developer that are explicitly mentioned. There is the mod developer, also called the maker. There is also the game dev, and then lastly, there's the software dev. And then lastly, there is the end user, which is the group that uses the product as by product of dev project, which basing on that, I'm probably gonna need a lot more room to explain this because that's only section one of like six. It's a BP license. Anyways, I am going to essentially just expand this. Need it this way, and then with let's go with like 3200 facing this way. So why mention each of these groups? Well, they have their own rights. the organization isn't really mentioned all that much, but they still have some involvement. So, rights the founder has, they can determine what can be done with their product. They can also, if necessary, revoke slash alter dev usage of product. And then to break that down, there is a clause in which this may be enforced. Specifically, they have the right regardless. However, the founder may only seek to enforce the usage if the developer of the project breaks the license or any of this product sub licenses from the founder or the contributors. E.g., if the developer just doesn't follow the license in which the section of the code that they took is licensed, for example. E.g., if the product that alters the the project that alters the product is altered without comments, documentation, etc., or if the credits to the function that they're taking is not credited or attributed, then they end up in this clause where the founder may alter or flat out revoke, depending on the case, the usage of the product in their project. And lastly, they can restrict rights associated I have the right key with the product IP. So what this means, the founder can essentially, if if there is IP associated with the product, for example, any of the following mascots, assets, fonts, screenshots, or example code associated with the product in its documentation or anywhere else on the organization. For example, the tester would also fall under this license. The example code mentioned in the documentation would fall under it. The screenshots in which are displayed on the page would fall under it, and the mascot of the library would fall under it. And if there was a custom font, that would also fall under it. This is mainly just as another step of preventing our stuff from being taken and put onto some other page, which is unassociated with us, and they benefit instead of us. Next, we have the contributors clause. This is split up into two sections. First, we'll cover their rights, and then later we'll cover their responsibilities. So, rights wise, what is listed, you may ask, is essentially that they can include a license under the condition that it does not violate this license, primarily over the product's usage, e.g., any rights given to the developer or end user cannot be violated, or to the founder as well. The second case, well, right mentioned is that if a dev breaks license, it must be sent to the founder, which would essentially mean more or less that if a developer breaks the license in any way and the contributor notices, they need to contact the founder in order to get it resolved and fixed, which would correlate with the second right of the founder, which is revoking or altering dev usage of a product so that it may be enforced properly. I'm going to take a break real quick and then we'll be right back to recording. I need to get another drink. All right, back to recording. The third light right listed is that a contributor's license will only affect their code. Well, more so, their contributes to the code base, which to essentially explain is that if they apply a license or contribute, they have the ultimate say over whether their code can be used elsewhere or how it's used or what restrictions its users may have, similar with any assets like art, fonts, etc. They have the ultimate say over their stuff, essentially. And then there's a fourth right listed, which is less a right, more so just what happens when a contributor breaks another contributor license. Which to keep it a little simpler is I'm just gonna abbreviate it as C license. Which to explain that is as worded in the document, quote, if a contributor breaks the license of another contributor, the contributor that broke it must adhere to whatever policy the contributor that made it has. Which is essentially saying that when a contributor breaks the license of another contributor, the one that broke it essentially has to follow whatever the one that made it had put in place for conditions where it is broken and must adhere to that policy. Ideally, the founder would be contacted, but they can also resolve that themselves. Just as long as conditions aren't egregious, though that's not mentioned. So that's kind of just gray area of how the license is handled. And then there is a fifth part, which essentially says a license must be reviewed by founders slash org in order to be included. This is to make sure that policies aren't unfair or anything. Also, sorry if I lean a bit too close to the mic. I'm actively trying to like down at the phone, which makes my voice move associated with the mic because it's fixed now. But yeah, the purpose for the review is just to make sure that any sublicense is not heinous in terms of rights. E.g., it is not extreme to the point where a developer would not want to use the product and stuff. And then section 2, responsibilities, which has roughly the same amount of sections. The first one is that the product must remain open source as long as the license stands on the product. All code in the product must have full XML L documentation, which, as stated in the license, must include, when applicable to a function, the summary, the param name descriptions, the returns, and a remarks section. The remarks is not really meant for your remarks about the function. It's more so just about containing credits that lead back to the contributor and how the founder, another contributor, or a developer may contact the contributor if need be in the future to explain what code does if they don't explain it all that great. Which, mind you, really wordy. It's essentially just saying that the function must be fully documented and have a way to contact the developer that made the function, just in case things happen. Third, this code covers the principle that any code that the contributor deems to be obsolete must be marked with the tab tag, and it may not be deleted, which is as a means of ensuring that anyone who is using that code does not get their code broken because the function was removed in an update. I know that most developers would normally not have something like this, but I want to ensure that we break as little as possible when updating libraries. That way, we have a stable source in which, when a library updates, we don't break what was already there, so that developers can just expand rather than having to refactor everything. The fourth responsibility, the contributor's code must not break any functionality of another function, class, or project. What this says is essentially that if they make a change, that code may not be broken when putting it into the library. E.g., if it functioned before, it must continue functioning. This is to prevent faulty code from getting into the core library, and also to prevent the code breaking when in usage by another developer. And then lastly, there is a fifth one, which essentially says that a commit must be fully documented. E.g., if you make changes, list all the changes that you made and how they were. Well, you don't really need that. You just need to list every change made, mainly. But it would be nice if you included, like, how you changed it and also why you changed it. Though that would probably be covered in comments. But yeah, essentially that. Now, on to the fourth section, which I'm gonna move down this direction. The devs, which we are going to start with the first clause mentioned, which is the mod makers clause, which this section is mainly outlined in the form of restrictions upon them rather than rights. And it's also in the form of conditions. So it's probably going to be harder to explain. So I'll just state it word for word and then recap what it means. Quote, if this product needs to be placed onto a modding site, rather than including it with the developer's project, standalone, and or uploading it as a separate project, contact the founder or the organization to have the product placed on to the given site. So as an example, if needed on Thunder Store, contact org or founders, this is done so that once again our code and product say ours. And if the site allows for donations, we can get donations off the product to help support development and stuff. E.g., if a mod maker needs the product, they contact us, which then we provide the product onto their site. This is also to make sure that licensing still stands properly too. So the next one listed, if the developer must have the product shipped with their project, the project must list any and all licenses placed upon the product in some way, shape, or form. And on the site hosting the developer's project, it must state that this product is shipped with it, which is essentially just saying that, hey, if you're gonna ship this, we need the credits plus licenses known. This is to prevent things like our code not having the license it's supposed to have, which means that the end user or the developer that uses it in future does not know what they're limited to. This doesn't affect the developer's project, it just affects our project within the usage of that project. And then lastly, if the founder or organization deems it necessary, they may get the developer's project taken down with allowance for it to go back up under the following condition. The project uses this product from a package uploaded to Zed's site by the organization or the founder, which in short means that if a mod maker uploads it themselves, we may get it taken down and we may re upload it on our own package, which you would then depend on to have your mod listed once more. And then the next section covers the game developers clause, which these clauses are pretty much similar. If the project is shipped with a developer's project, as long as there's a link back to any and all licenses placed upon the product in some way, shape, or form, then it is fine. And then if the product needs to be placed on an asset store or similar, contact the founder or organization to have the product placed onto the site. E.g., if product need contact founder or the organization. And then that is the game devs clause done. A lot simpler than mod makers because mod makers just have a few more restrictions as we are also modders ourselves and we want to make sure our stuff's credited properly. Lastly, there's the software dev portion. Well, no, not lastly because there's a general part of this too. But the last separated dev part. This product may be shipped with the developer's project as long as there's a link back to any and all licenses placed upon the product in some way, shape, or form, e.g., again, shipped, rec, license, slash attribution. The second one, if the product needs to be placed onto any site in which the project from the developer needs it, contact the founder or the organization to have the products placed. E.g., contact org to place. And then section C, the developer may ask for certain functionality be added to the product to the founder or organization. However, there is no guarantee it will happen quick or soon. In the case it doesn't get added, you may add it yourself to the product via contribution, or you may make an extension product that extends upon this product. This license must be shipped with any extension, which covers a few different rights. So, to summarize, give me a second, my nose is being a dick. Dev may request functionality. Dev may let me just go over that wording again, just so I don't say this wrong. Dev may contribute. Dev may extend. Rec license. And then now for the developer's clause on its own, let me go wrap this over to here. The developer must utilize this product as it was intended. Do not utilize it for the purpose of exploiting what it does for unfair gain. E.g., use as intended. The developer must not decompile this product in any way, shape, or form. And it is open source for a reason. Look at the direct source code if needed to see what the product is doing. So essentially, don't decompile. Use source. And mind you, that is not to limit what a developer can do with the product. It's mainly to ensure that they are seeing what they are actually supposed to see when looking at the source code. They may use writer's built-in decompiler. However, that won't be as accurate as it would be looking at the actual source code. So it's recommended to look at the actual source code for the source code. The next one essentially simplifies to don't re-upload contact or if needed. Section D, the developer may request for functionality to be added if deemed necessary. Contact the founder of the product for the functionality, but first check if the organization behind it has another product that adds the functionality sought. E.g., dev may request functionality. Dev may contribute. However, they must follow contributor clause. Okay. I believe there's one section left. Yes. So now, lastly, we have the end user. This is structured in the form of what they may not do and what to do. If the end user finds exploits, bugs, or any of the likes, contact the founder directly so it can be resolved immediately. E.g., find exploit, contact founder. The second one, the user may not alter this product for purposes of altering a developer's project and how it works. E.g., they may not alter library to interfere with dev project. And then lastly, if deemed necessary, the organization or founder may add more restrictions to the section, e.g., more restrictions. Hey. Apply. If you cannot tell, it is really early in the morning. And then that covers the entirety of the Cecil license. If you can't tell, it covers a lot. And then lastly, I'm going to go over the license I have on my code within the library, which is a MIT derivative. E.g., it's a license that derives off of MIT. Which I'm mainly going to cover the new parts of the license. The main things are that, again, attribution is required. Alterations that are not allowed would be, for example, essentially just minuscule stuff like changing comments, stripping comments, adding comments, changing variable names, changing types, or adding or removing variables that make no change to the code. E.g., may not be one to one, may not have redundant change. And then again, this would apply to, in this case, Zaxby mod, which is, again, the same group of people, e.g., me. Anyways, I hope that helped clear the air over what the heck is Cecil. But as a summary, Cecil Libraries is a group of libraries in which extend the functionality of C Sharp, System, and other APIs in order to be more usable. And with that, I'll call it here. I'm probably not gonna do really all that much editing. I'm not in a editing boat right now. Plus, I have a project to work on for Pony Island. So, I'll just catch you in the next video when that's worked on. And no, this video does not fall under the Cecil license. Future ones may, but this one, no. This is just me covering what it's about. Anyways, I'll catch you in the next one, and sorry for forgetting the music.